Hello everyone, welcome. Both the on location face-to-face crowd and the cyberspace audience. Another episode of Wednesday Night Live. I've been doing this class now for 32 years in unbroken chain, week after week. One of the oldest members is sitting right here, Jeff, who was 16 years old when I met him.
Wow.
So 16 plus 32.
I know I'm not 17 then.
And now his wife is about to expect the first child they're going to have.
Yay.
But I want to dedicate the class to the mother of a very dear friend, Mark Belinsky, who literally passed away yesterday, 2 days ago. Today was her funeral. Her name is Asya Bat Ben Sion and Sarah, 18th of Sivan. So may her soul benefit from these words, and may we benefit from her. And at the end of the day, just as a short introduction, as some of the thinkers say, we're not physical human beings on a spiritual journey, we're spiritual beings on a physical journey. However, our myopic lens and perspective allows us to see very little, which is the surface level of existence and of the world, when beneath the surface lie layers and layers and layers, and no one even knows how far down the rabbit hole goes. You know, there was a time where they thought the world was made up of elements, then they discovered molecules, and then they discovered atoms, and then discovered subatomic particles, and now we know already they're subatomic. And any scientist will acknowledge that we have no idea how many substratas there are as you go deeper down. And the same thing is in the human being. You know, once there are limbs and organs, and then we discovered there are internal organs, and then we discovered cells, all the way down to chromosomes, DNA, that is absolutely microscopic, and that too has infinite layers. But if you open up any book on Jewish mysticism, Zohar or the writings of the Arizal, you'll see documented a whole map that talks all about the inner workings of what makes things tick. So just like a clock has its mechanisms, so too does existence, so too do each of us. And another beautiful, eloquent element in this Kabbalistic thought is the idea that everything is microcosm, macrocosm, which is also becoming a scientific reality, and that is that everything that exists in the large scale also exists in the smallest scale, which DNA is a perfect example of that, stem cells is another, and especially in quantum mechanics, you know today that the smallest atoms, billions of miles away, are made up of exactly the same thing that consists of matter in this world here, in our material world. So it's not surprising for someone who's familiar somewhat with the mystical to know that the inner forces are what make everything tick. What's even more fascinating, and this is where science has not yet reached, and that is not only is there an inner to the outer, but it's actually the outer that is just a reflection of the inner, which means it doesn't work the other way around, that first there's an outer reality and then we dig inside and we look for what makes it tick. First the forces that make it tick exist, the energy, and then comes matter, which is hence what I said before, that we are spiritual beings on a physical journey, not the other way around. Since I'm mentioning a passing of a soul, so I just repeat something I share often here. The big question everyone asks, where does the soul go to after we die? We want to know about our loved ones. Where are they? Are they close? Are they far? Do they know what we're doing? Do they not? And the question we ask, where do they go? Where does the soul go? And it's important to point out that the question itself is based on a very false premise. I would even say an arrogant premise. And that is that we think we are where it's at, so we wonder where the soul goes to. Who says you are where it's at? Who says we're the center of the universe? And I always use an imaginary dialogue between, let's say, a refrigerator and appliance with electricity. So the appliance asks the electricity in this imaginary conversation, where do you go when they pull the plug? The refrigerator asks. And the electricity is all incredulous and says, what do you mean where I go? Where do you come from? You're a little box that they just invented in the last 100 or 200 years. They figured out how to generate and contain electricity in this box to refrigerate and keep food cool and fresh. Now you're wondering where I go? Where'd you come from? You're this little box, and now you think you're the center of the world. I go back to my natural place, which is not confined by time and space as you know it. And the fact that I was inside of you is only for a short period of time. That's not my natural being. It's exactly the same thing. For us to ask where a soul goes is equivalent of a little box trying to figure out the mysteries of the cosmos. And yet we're so accustomed and so trapped, so seduced by this world, that that's all we see, and to the point we think to the exclusion of everything else. And yes, we may have some sense that there's something out there. There's more to life than what you more than what more you, not what you see is not what you get. And we imagine and we dream and we lift our eyes to the heavens and we spend billions of dollars just to see if there's someone out there, etc. So, but it all seems like an exotic search, when in truth, when you get accustomed to the spiritual workings, you start realizing that's natural place. And we are the anomaly. We are the novelty. When I say we, I mean our consciousness. So it becomes a fascinating discussion of how these two get bridged. How does our limited consciousness, the refrigerator, the appliance, the box, connect to that which is beyond the box? And this is what Judaism is all about. The fusion and integration of matter and spirit, matter and energy. And when you talk about God, instead of the so-called nursery school version of God, think of God as the essence of it all. And if you go down the rabbit hole, that's what you'll hit. So it takes on a far deeper meaning than just some type of biblical primitive concept of believing a supernatural or superstitious God that creates earthquakes when people misbehave, but rather becomes the deepest essence of all reality. And then you start realizing how sophisticated Judaism is, and realizing that the body, what we call mitzvot, the body of laws, is not just commandments and laws, but anyone that knows Hebrew knows the word mitzvah means connections. Connections is a lot more intriguing than commandments. Nobody wants to be commanded. Everybody wants to be connected, whether it's through mobile phones or through networking or who you know, that type of thing. So connections, you want to write, no, okay, where am I getting connected to? And that's what a mitzvah means. It's a bridge, a connection from this refrigerator to the so-called electricity. And an avera, which is the antithesis of a mitzvah, what we call sin, is actually disconnection. Avera means in Hebrew a displacement. It means havara. Avera comes from the word being displaced. So think of like a displaced joint or displaced elbow. When something's not aligned, something isn't working. A mitzvah is a connection, an alignment, and an aberration is a misalignment. So in a spiritual sense of things, there's what consists of a healthy human being where things are aligned, where you feel at peace, there's harmony, there's a type of seamlessness. Children have that naturally until they get corrupted by us, adults. Not by you, I'll speak for the rest of the adults. And then there's, as we get jaded and we get older and we begin to become cynical or skeptical or we get disappointed, things get broken in our lives, and whenever that happens, misalignments begin to come into play. If it's full-blown dysfunctionality or not, but it's definitely not the alignment. You ever see newborn children? They breathe. Healthy children, they breathe. It's like symmetrically. You see their chests heaving up and down. The lungs are being used 100%. By the time you're age 7, 8 years old, you're using 80% of your lungs. That's why usually, unless you're in very good shape, not conditioned, try to take a deep breath, and you'll usually cough. Because when you breathe in, you use the bottom part of your lungs, which is now mostly occupied by toxins. It doesn't come natural to us. So as we begin to absorb the toxins of this world, and I mean that not just physically but also metaphorically, then our bodies begin to wear down. We begin to age, and we begin to be misaligned. And in a spiritual sense, the same is true. So when the Kabbalah and mysticism talks about healthy living, for instance, let's take the simplest example, chesed, to be kind, to be charitable. So most of us think of it as an obligation, which is very decent. God blessed you with a gift, whether it's financially or wisdom or whatever it is that you have experience in. So it's only proper to share. That's the basic definition. But the truth is, it goes deeper. When you give chesed, you're actually feeding and nourishing, just as different foods nourish and with vitamins and nutrients. Different actions nourish our soul. So there's actually a chesed inside your soul. The soul is made up of, as you may be familiar, the 10 spheres, 10 faculties that evolve from 10 spiritual forms of attributes, divine attributes. So when you do chesed, besides giving someone else, you're feeding yourself. And when you don't, there's a part of your soul that becomes asphyxiated. So interesting. Suddenly the whole thing turns around that charity may be doing more for you than for the one that you're giving to, which is actually a statement in the Medrash. So you see, when you start looking at things from the inside out instead of the outside in, new perspectives. You start getting a new perspective on life. But we never overestimate the power and the seduction and the hypnotic power of the tentacles of this material world, because it tugs you right back. As much as you know this spirituality, you walk down the street, you see something that attracts you, if it's healthy or not, you get drawn to it. And all these wisdoms suddenly disappear.
I know.
You want to come up here and tell us about it? We all have our story, don't worry about it. Yes, we all have our story. Levitsa Baditchever once famously said, beautiful statements he said to God. He was always arguing with God about everything and trying to defend the human race. And he said to God, he says, big, in Yiddish he said, Grace Kunz. You know what Grace Kunz is? Big trick. You gave them a material world in which they live. And you write in the books about spiritual worlds. Why don't you give them the spiritual world to live in and write in the books about the material world? And you'll see how they behave. That's the story. So we read about it, we hear about it, we sense it. And we all know, as spiritual as you may be, listen, a few dollars, a little covet, a little honor, a little other distraction can pull you right back into the whirlpool, to the vortex of the material world. The box. So the challenge is constantly like a tug of war. Tension and resolution in language of Yecheskel the prophet, and used a lot in Kabbalistic and Hasidic writings, Ratzeh and Shuv. Tension and resolution. A healthy measure of tension and resolution is the key to life. I always mention the cardiologist that comes quite often to this class. So he helps heal many hearts, but his own heart is broken in relationships and in other ways. He's always telling me, he just wishes life would be simpler, calm, some bliss. He wants some animal bliss. I don't know if you use the word animal, but bliss. So I always tell him, whenever he says that to me, I say to him, so you mean like a flat line? So he says, no, not a flat line. A cardiogram, flat line is not a good sign. It's very smooth and very simple. Flat line is like the shortest route between 2 points, but it's not good for life. It's called death. What does a good heart look like? Like a wave. Literally like a wave. So too high of peaks or too low valleys, obviously, is an imbalanced life, as I said, misaligned. Too much tension or too much resolution. Anxiety that is a form of too much tension. But have angst, a healthy measure of angst, a healthy measure of discomfort. To get out of your comfort zone is very healthy. And same thing the other way. Too much resolution where you're just calm all the time. No challenge is also not healthy. So it's always a balance between some tension and resolution. Like climbing a ladder. You don't jump too many rungs, but you always have to have your foot going to the next level. Or as some of the Hasidic masters say, you have to always keep your eyes to heaven with your feet firmly planted on the ground. That's sometimes a difficult dance, because it's much easier just to go one direction. Like going two directions. But that's what it's about. So in a sense, this is this essence of Judaism, and now I want to bring it out to the topic at hand. I could talk just about this. We could talk about this all night, all our lives actually. And that is regarding this particular day in the Jewish calendar. So often I address the weekly chapter in Torah, try to touch upon that as well. But today, since being that it's the 20th of Sivan, something I haven't addressed, I believe, in the previous years, according to my memory, I thought it was a good topic to address because it's just a unique chapter in Jewish history which illuminates tremendous insights in the microcosm of our own lives. As I just mentioned, macrocosm, microcosm. History itself is reflected in our own personal lives. What's so beautiful? Oops. Is the sound going right there? History itself is reflected in our own personal lives. In the sense, you can say the beginning of history is like the child. The Middle Age is like the middle-aged person, and the later generations in history are like adulthood and older age. So, in that sense, we can learn many lessons from history, not just lessons that not to repeat that which was done, or to just be aware of our heritage and our past. Are we right? Huh? Jeff, yes or no? But also lessons that actually reflect in our own personal lives. Now, Jewish history in particular is probably the most turbulent of all. Because I don't know if there's another nation in the world that has gone through so many ups and downs as we have. You know, when you talk about ups and downs, and I'm not talking once or twice, literally from almost the beginning of time, whether Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, Abraham later, the Jews in Egypt, and then the generations, battles in Israel, and then the first temple, the second temple. Literally with every empire, every major empire, the Jews were under their control. They faced the almost brink of annihilation, just to come bouncing back, which is why the Talmud says that the Jewish people are compared to a moon. The sun is a steady light. It has sun flares, sunspots, and so on, but it's pretty steady. The moon is constantly changing, and has many mystical meanings, the phases of the moon. And you see how it mystifies us. You see two people in love, you never see them staring at a sun. You see them gazing at a moon. Even though the moon, you can say, technically is a reflection of the sun. But we see it's not just a reflection like a mirror. It has its own glow. It has its own haunting element. The myths of the werewolf, of the full moon, and all other full moon type of mythologies, as well as the effects of it on the tides on earth. So it has its own relationship with us. The Talmud preempts much of this literature and says the Jewish people are compared to the moon. It's actually a feminine type of personality with this constant change, even on a biological level, on a physical level, which is far more reflective of real life, which is time. Life is mobile. Life is not some just static state. It's constantly changing. But in the context of the Jewish people, one of the key elements is because the moon waxes and wanes, and as it wanes, it comes down to a point where it disappears, which is why we call the next day the new moon, the birth of the new moon. We celebrate Rosh Chodesh, the head of the month. We actually make a blessing on the new moon. Moses was shown the new moon when the Jews left Egypt. So the moon becomes a symbol of the renewal just at the point of extinction. And the lesson, of course, is that nothing ever gets extinct. The Jews are a perfect example of it. After the Holocaust and all the previous persecutions, you'd think we couldn't bounce back. Every time there's a renewal. So the 20th of Sivan particularly is significant because it's spelled out in some of our holy books. They talk about different fast days of when Jews fast. So we know the famous fast, the classical ones, of course, Yom Kippur, Tisha B'Av, the saddest day in the Jewish calendar, when the two temples were destroyed. And we have the 17th of Tammuz, when Jerusalem was, the walls were scaled, and the walls fell down. We have the 10th of Tevet, when the walls were encircled. We have the day after Rosh Hashanah, Tzom Gedalia, and the fast of Esther. These are the famous fasts. Some people just know of Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av, etc. But there's actually a sefer called there's actually a tractate called the Tractate of Fasting. But there's also other books that talk about other fast days. And the 20th of Sivan, which is today, is designated, the Magen Avram, which was a great commentator on Shulchan Aruch when he brings the fasts, he brings that in Poland there was a custom that they would fast on the 20th of Sivan. The Shari Tshuva and other commentaries there explain the reasons for it. Two major tragedies took place on this day. One in the 12th century and one in the 17th century. And as you see in a moment, they really captured the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, especially for the Jewish people. So in the 12th century, begin with that on this day, the way that's documented, the story goes, it was one of the earliest blood libels. A Jewish, delivery man or some sort of person was walking at night in the town, in a city in, I think it was, what city was it in France? I don't recall right now. Maybe Lyon, I'm not sure. And he was walking, and he witnessed a murder of a child. When the peasant who murdered the child saw the Jew, he decided to blame it on him. He went running to the priest, and he says he saw a Jew kill the child, to take its blood for the matzahs for Passover. This was this blood libel. I believe the first blood libel was not in that year, it was a few years earlier in England, but this was one of the early ones. And of course this was an excuse to incite the crowd, and I believe 30 or 40 Jews were massacred. Well, first they were arrested, they were forced to confess. If you baptize yourselves, you become Christians, we'll save you. They chose not to, and it's a long story, but briefly, it began a pogrom and a massacre of those Jews. Okay, you could say 30 Jews. Listen, every life matters, but it's not like you can't compare it to the Holocaust. But this day became symbolic because a little while later, the Jews were expelled from France. This is one of the first expulsions from a major country in Europe, from France. And this began a trend. If you go through the Middle Ages, from the 12th century on, if it wasn't France, it was England. In the 15th century, it became Spain. The golden age of Spain, the expulsion from Spain, 1492. And this began a pattern in either expelled, overtaxed, and discrimination. So the 20th of Sivan, this day, became symbolic because it began then. So it wasn't just the tragedy of that day, but it began a series and put things into motion of what would be the terrors that Jews would suffer throughout the Middle Ages. Then comes the one of the 17th century, is known, some of you may be familiar with Jewish history, there was a thing called the Gzeres Tach v'Tat. It's like the decrees of Tach and Tat are just acronyms for the Hebrew years, Tav Ches and Tav Tes, which would correspond to 1608 and 1609, I believe. No, 1648 and 1649. Tach v'Tach. So in 1640 and 1649, you may have heard Chomnetsky, who, by the way, still today in Poland, there are big statues of him as a hero. And he was one of the big Jew baiters, the Hitler of their time, in its own way, and led these pogroms across Poland, especially in Eastern Europe. Serious pogroms where they massacred thousands upon thousands. And remember, Jews were not in the millions as they are today. Some people say there's more Jewish blood in the rivers of Europe than water. Because this was the place where most Jews lived. There were the Jews, of course, from the Spanish, or I should say the Sephardic countries, but they too were expelled from Spain. So where do you think they went? Many of them went to Amsterdam or to other countries. They migrated. Eastern Europe, of course, became the bastion, became the center. But this wasn't just Eastern Europe. It was Central Europe, Germany, France, as I mentioned, and so on. But just for the record, this is the place where also the greatest scholarship was taking place. Rashi was in France. The Tosafites, the people who wrote Tosfos, were in other countries in that area. This was the bread and butter. This was like one of the richest periods in Jewish scholarship, which itself is a study which I'm going to discuss in a few moments, how these two work. Most people in times of war are not publishing books or writing poetry or creating music. They're running for their lives or trying to protect themselves. And here, during these bloodbaths, you have some of the greatest commentaries and some of the greatest works of literature in Jewish scholarship ever to be produced, which itself is interesting. How? In literature today, one big fad is what they call deconstruction. Deconstructing literature, where you take a novel or you take another work of literature, whether it's fiction, non-fiction, and students are taught by professors how to deconstruct literature. What does that mean? To strip it of the characters or even of the time period and try to understand the writer and his personality. You could see here, maybe a hint to his alcoholic mother or his abusive grandfather. I'm just being a little humorous, but the idea is to deconstruct literature and try to understand a deeper story that you don't hear on the actual pages, between the lines. And you could find a lot, because a writer obviously is under the impression of the environment around him. Shakespeare has been deconstructed in hundreds of ways, trying to understand who this man was, because he's quite mysterious in the character, the personality. Some even say he was not even real, he wasn't even real. But regardless, definitely with the way he writes, take, for example, from a Jewish perspective, you take Shylock, the character, Merchant of Venice, or other characters, and you can see a lot. You can see his attitude, what was the prevalent view on Jews. Some say Merchant of Venice is is a work of anti-Semitic work. Some say it was not at all anti-Semitic, sympathetic, or it was just the culture of the times. That's how you way to Jew somebody, which is Shakespeare's line. So this is deconstructing.
Now let's a parallel. Jews are the people of the book. And as I mentioned, we have unbelievable works. Rashi lived in the 11th century, close to this time. Rashi, one of the greatest works, maybe the greatest commentator of all. Today it's indispensable. You cannot read Chumash. You cannot read the Torah Bible without Rashi. How they read it before Rashi? We have to say that people understood what Rashi understood. So besides his interpretation, it's also his concise language. He almost created Hebrew anew. The way he wrote, the way he was able to describe. And such brevity. Just to give you an example, Rashi didn't just write a commentary on the entire Bible. He also wrote a commentary on most of the Talmud. Except a few tractates where he never had a chance to finish writing. So his grandson, the Rabbeinu Tam, writes a commentary. And for every line in Rashi, Rabbeinu Tam needs 5 lines. Literally. You suddenly see Rashis that take up, let's say, a column. Rabbeinu Tam takes on like 10 columns. He couldn't emulate his own grandfather's concise style. As we know, short is long. As Winston Churchill once wrote a long letter to his friend and then apologized at the end and said, I'm sorry for not having time to write a shorter letter. Because it takes more time to be short than to be long. And Rashi. So Rashi, commentator. You study this commentary and has been studied and analyzed by commentators and counter-commentators. Literally, I think there's probably over 100 authors that wrote commentary just on Rashi. Full commentary. I don't just mean referring to him. So you like deconstruct Rashi. If you read Rashi, you read his whole commentary, you'll find profound insights. I challenge anyone to try to figure out what kind of time period he lived in. If you read it, you'd think a man to be able to write with such precision was living on the south, in the south of France, probably by beachfront property, very wealthy, calm and relaxed, and has the presence of mind to write a commentary. You wouldn't believe that Rashi was writing it literally as bullets, the equivalent of bullets, were whizzing by his. There were no bullets then. There were bloodbaths. And Rashi himself was in danger, and his children, and so on. He starts saying, how does a man have the ability to just be so able to sit down? Now, you could say, okay, one genius is able to do it. But you go through the commentators, the writers, the Rashba, the Bali Tesvis, and so on, hundreds and hundreds of them, living in the fear of death any moment, expelled and killed and assassinated and all the other discriminations I mentioned, and all had this presence. And you don't see them ever complaining. They never write like, I'll get back to this because right now the Jews are being marched out to be hung or being killed. You never hear any type of bitterness. So as a skeptic would say, you'd say they're either completely out of touch, which is hard to imagine, cared about their families and about their lives, or they had this unbelievable ability to transcend, which of course is the real answer. But this is not something you can deny. This is a fact of historical fact. You can look up at these books, they're published, which is also a miracle, that most of it even reached us. It was so easy for it to get lost. It was all manuscripts. And yet Jews always valued the words, and they made sure to preserve it. Even when in France, they were burning the Bible and the Talmud, etc., and in Germany as well. So what's this lesson from Chaf? So even though many Jews don't have the custom to fast today, there are some that do. Some say only in Polish, because it happened mostly in Poland. There's actually some commentators that say the word Poland, where's the word come from? Poland is a word we say in Yiddish or in Hebrew, Poland. Poland. So there's one that writes that Poland comes from a acronym, 2 words, Polin. Here is where we rested. Because Poland became a resting place for many Jews. It became a respite. And some write that it was relatively to other countries was peaceful. I guess this was more in the earlier ages. Later it became one of the hardest. After the Nazis, of course, Poland was the 3 million of the 6 million were Polish Jews. But before that, it was seen as, I guess, at a time in history where it was considered to be relatively a quiet period, which is why Judaism flourished there. So even though not everybody fasts, but the significance of the day, I think, has unbelievable implications. And let me explain. Just put things in context again. The 12th century I mentioned was the beginning of a series of events. The next few centuries would be murder, literally, for Jews. The 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries. As you know, in general history, when did when do we consider the beginning of what they call the Dark Ages? When did the Dark Ages start lightening up? No pun intended. They started lightening up following the Renaissance, which is the basically 15th, 16th century, and that led into what was called the Enlightenment. And then, the direct result, the emancipation of the Jews. So if you're familiar with that history, this is where basically Middle Ages enters modernity. To understand our times, you have to understand the 17th century. It's impossible to understand where we are without understanding, because that was a real transition century. That was essentially when the waves of what we call democracy and freedom began to sweep through Europe. What does that mean? We take it for granted. But remember, the concept of individual rights did not exist. Not for Jews, for nobody. The monarch or the church leader was an absolute monopoly over power, and they were the children of God. They chose what is your destiny. With one word, you were alive or dead. And that's where you had the very strong class distinctions. And anyone that read, we all read, it was a necessary reading in high school with A Tale of Two Cities, which for some is the whole, where they learned anything about France and the French Revolution. This was the big issue, the upper class, the bourgeois, and the proletariat. What later, or George Orwell would call the proles. Okay, and which is basically the working class, who were discriminated against, who were basically used and exploited and abused in every possible way, until things came to a head. But it wasn't just that people started saying enough is enough. They had no recourse. It wasn't like you could go and join together and do something about it. Where are you going? You went one monarchy to the next. If you were lucky, the monarch was either so busy with his women or horses, so he didn't bother, or he happened to be benevolent. But if you were not lucky, you had what you had. And everybody knows of how the Presbyterian Church was born. The Anglican Church was due to King in England, King Henry VIII, who loved his women. And one woman would not marry him unless he divorced his Spanish wife, which was a prearranged marriage for Spain and England to be in partnership. That, by the way, we're real it's not the Hasidim, it's the pre-arranged marriages with the monarchs in the Middle Ages. That's where it started from. Anyway, she never gave him a boy, so that was his excuse, and he had his mistresses. Till one would not marry him unless divorced, but he's Catholic, and there's no divorcing. So he appealed to the Pope. Everybody knows the story. And then what happens, of course, he decides, Oliver Cromwell convinces him, you know what, the Pope is going to tell you what to do, you tell the Pope what to do. He doesn't agree to the divorce, you create your own church. So a whole new church was created. How do you like that? Not for spiritual reasons, exactly. It's interesting. The whole thing was created by one guy who was basically what they call a noyef, a baltaiva. How do you say that in English, Rabbi, back there? A person just would indulge in his own desire, created a whole church just around that, which is its own little irony. But I'm not getting into that right now. These were the Middle Ages. Many factors that are still being analyzed and explored and debated led to the changes that would take place. Because remember, people in power don't want to give up power. So it wasn't suddenly the monarchs had some type of epiphany, oh, you know what, let's give equal rights to everybody. It didn't work exactly like that. There was a bloody revolutionary French Revolution, then came the American Revolution, etc., etc. And it was all cumulative, ultimately led to a world that we call a free world. What does free mean? That we have today recourse, yes. There's the respect of individual rights. I'm not saying there isn't corruption and there isn't abuse, but it's a whole different world today. That one person controls it all does not exist quite in the same way. There are people who still have conspiracy theories. That's still the case. Well, the point is that things changed, and for whom did they change most? For the Jewish people. Because they were the most discriminated. So when these new so-called attitudes began to take hold, the Jews were the first that benefited from it. So the period that I'm talking about, the 12th century and then the 17th, are not just nice little, they're not just anomalies or some type of blips on the screen. They're part of a process that led to where we are today. And the events that happened on this Chof Sivan, which was so tragic, on one hand, actually gave birth to some unbelievable things. So it doesn't justify the tragic events, but it gives context and perspective of how things change. I'll start with an example. It's not really an example. It's actually fascinating insight. Everybody knows about they called it the plague, the Black Plague, that I believe wiped out around 40% of Europe, the Middle Ages. Was that percent? Maybe even higher. Definitely very up there. Almost half the population just died. The plague. Jews, by the way, were blamed for this too, that they were poisoning the wells. No one can ever figure out what the motive was exactly, because you probably know that in a matzah, you barely could put water and flour to mix blood. First of all, Jews are prohibited from drinking blood. I'm just saying this in case any of you believe the blood libel. Anybody here that is a Jewish anti-Semite, or just raise your hand. So Jews are prohibited to put blood in the matzahs. Is just completely insane. But I don't even feel the need to defend it. So here, this is something very fascinating that I read this a while ago, and you can check it up. I was like almost blown away by this. One of the big factors that brought freedom to Europe and then later to the world was the plague. You wonder how? The plague was just death. It was death everywhere. I mean, if you read about what was going on, it was the death. Remember, it wasn't just the plague; it was extremely contagious. And then, of course, you have dead bodies around, so it created even more disease. It was just Europe was one big cemetery, graveyard. So here's what happened. Remember that the numbers of the monarchs and the so-called bourgeois, the high class, the upper class, were small. The numbers of the working class were very high. So the plague did not discriminate; it just took everyone. But who suffered most? The working class. So suddenly, there were half the workforce due to the plague. So suddenly, workers could make more demands because you couldn't find a worker so easily, and that allowed the workers to join together and start charging more, and they gave them more rights. Can you imagine? The death of half of them created demand, and their ability to demand more, and that started breaking the monopoly. Because like when you have a million slaves to choose from, yeah, but if you only have 500,000 and you just had 1 million before, now everybody's value goes up. Why did it blow me away? Because it's like, again, no way am I trying to in any way sanctify death, but it's tremendous insight to see how something can turn into a complete opposite that anyone would ever imagine after the fact. You see it's similar in nature. I don't know if you've ever gone to forests that have been ravaged by forest fires. It's a fascinating study in resilience, especially if you go just a short period after a whole area has been completely wiped out. You look how nature regenerates itself. You never believe it. How resourcefulness, how mushrooms start growing, and then how this. If you have someone, especially a guide, show you how nature knows how to rebuild itself. As a matter of fact, as you know, we know today many forest fires are actually deliberate because it's necessary to create create the nutrition and the nourishment of land. Often requires burning it down. Which, by the way, as an aside, the Chinuch writes as much about Shemitah. Next year will be a Shemitah year, which is a sabbatical when we rest the lands in Israel, only in Israel. So he writes one of the reasons for it is because I'm like a machine. If you work it all the time, it burns out. So once a year we rest the land so the land can regenerate itself. I read critique. People said it's ridiculous. Look it up today. Today it's seen as a fact that sometimes you could think a land is not like a human being. Of course, a human being can't work 24/7. Land, what's land? Why not? Just keep planting. There is a value to not plant or harvest a field for a period of time, and then it comes back with a lot more strength. It's very similar to, not because the land got tired, it's just healthy to have that type of cycle. So back to our topic here, this is captured very much in this day because what happened, even though there were such massacres, but remember when the Jews who are survivors had to deal with such challenges, you dig deeper. And when you dig deeper, great things happen. I'll start since the Hasidic world is close to my heart because I grew up in it. The Baal Shem Tov was born right after, basically, the Gzeres Tach V'Tat. We're talking about That's the Baal Shem Tov just gave us an acknowledgement. Yeah. It took on the shape of a cell phone, but that I said before, physical thing, reality evolves from spiritual reality. I ever told you I was doing a Shabbaton in the Korach shul. Upstairs there was they had like the Friday night dinner, and they asked me to speak after the chicken was served. And as I begin speaking, we all hear the cry of a rooster, which was very fitting because we just had eaten chicken. So some people were looking around. Is there like a rooster running around or something? The Korach shul, anything is possible. So but as you all know, so anyway, we found out that some roosters sound like cell phones. That was the story. But back to the topic here. So there's a statement in the Torah that says when the Jews were oppressed by the Egyptian exile, it says, Kashayano Esam ken yifre v'chen yifritz. In direct proportion, as they were oppressed, the more they were oppressed, the more they flourished and thrived and spread out. It's an interesting statement. I don't know who said it, Eleanor Roosevelt, and I'm just all in one breath. Chumash Shmois, Eleanor Roosevelt. Okay. I'll soon quote Jimi Hendrix just to round it all out. So, was it she that said, women are like tea bags. You don't know how strong they are until you put them into hot water. Well, I would say the same thing about the Jewish people in general, and in general, anyone that's really a strong person. You don't see strength until it's challenged. If you want to see the strength of the Jews in full glory, look at the most difficult times and chapters in our history. And I want to reiterate again, qualify. I'm not in any way trying to justify or find any redeeming factors in suffering. Suffering is a mystery that remains a mystery, and we ask God to give us all the benefits without the suffering. But after the fact, two things can happen to a person when they suffer. They either break down and die, unfortunately, psychologically or emotionally, or even worse than that, or they dig deeper and they find new resources. Only two options. I mean, you can go into denial for a short period of time, but that usually doesn't last. And those are the two options. And I'm not addressing here the why innocent people suffer. It's a whole different topic, which we may never have an answer for anyway. Job represented us all when he argued with God about it. But what we do about it is a whole different question. Not why, but what do you do about it? You can either be overwhelmed and it destroys, or you find deeper resources. And again, this doesn't redeem necessarily what happened, but it redeems the pain. It channels the grief in some fashion. And the events of the 20th of Sivan, today, we're talking now 4 centuries ago and almost 14 centuries ago, the 12th century, what are we now, the 21st, 9 centuries ago, were moments, watershed moments almost, that if you look at the panorama of history, not at the moment, you look at connect the dots, you see the forest from the trees, you could see these events led to tremendous renaissance of Jewish life. Even while we recognize, and we fast, some of us, for the tragedy and the great people that died, both in the Gzer of Tachvatat and in France, and there were some of the biggest leaders. We know their names, people like Shimshon Astropola, others like that, great scholars, for no other reason, simply because they were Jewish. These were not people who were counter-revolutionaries. They did not care about overthrowing the government. They were busy studying and praying all day. Why would they be a threat to anybody? There's another question. But people like that, even while that was happening, there was seeds being planted of unbelievable renaissance and growth. So the Baal Shem Tov was born in the year Nachas, Tov Nun Ches, literally 50 years, half a century, after Gzer's Tachvatat. Tov Ches, Tov Nun Ches. 50 years later. Now the Baal Shem Tov was a mysterious figure for many in history, for all of us, because he didn't leave a lot of writing, but he left many students. And he left particularly one student who brought us many students. There are all kinds of myths and critique of the Baal Shem Tov, which I just want to qualify. Some say he was a simple man. But the fact of the matter, the fact that he drew to him some of the greatest scholars of his time, I don't know if you're a scholar or not, but you could imagine that scholars are not usually drawn to ignoramuses. They may see beauty in a simple person, but they're not going to see them as their leader. You can't compare. It's two different things. So sometimes if you don't see writing of someone, but you see that great scholars are around him, you have to say that they recognize some scholarship. And with this Baal Shem Tov in Hasidic literature, it says, he came to awaken a faint Jewish people. Because you can imagine physically the toll that it took, this running from country to country, these massacres, these pogroms, and the unpredictability. You never knew when's going to come next. It was not like you living at home and you're going to have some type of weather warning or something, that there's a pogrom coming. To live like that, to live under fear all the time. Can you even imagine it? I can't imagine it. My father was born in Moscow. He used to tell me of the fear that they lived, 24/7 fear under Stalin. Now, if you know Stalin, you read the books about Stalin. Stalin was a culture of fear. This was deliberate. He was psychotic. I wouldn't say psychotic, he was a psychopath. Should be the right word. He was able to kill his own son and sleep peacefully that night. I mean, there's something wrong with such a person. And he led this great mighty nation. And fear. What means fear? He let no one be secure. He was always killing somebody. So everybody was always watching their back. That's how he kept control. I mean, he had like pleasure in this fear. And this fear seeped down, spilled over into all levels of society. So my father would tell me these stories. It was still almost like a fairy tale. Now, I believed him, but I wasn't there. You don't dare. You know, when you go to sleep at night and you feel calm because you live in your own home and you're tucked in by your parents, you know, you can't imagine going to sleep and literally heart pounding every night, every day. Who knows what's going to happen tonight or today? But this was the culture in which they lived. And what came out of it, they became the strongest people possible. They delivered the literature I described, the scholarship of the Middle Ages is unparalleled. You can never believe. If you did not know what they were going through, you'd think this was the golden age of scholarship because they were all living in peace. It's not true. Even Spain, the golden age, when Jews were at peace, they didn't produce as much as under the gun. Maybe because like the tea bag analogy, maybe. That was the way they preserved their sanity, to escape into transcendence of literature and scholarship and study and so on. But they did it. The Baal Shem Tov came around, and he came to awaken the morale and the physical stamina of the Jews took a serious toll. Because though they maintained, obviously, their commitment, but they were broken psychologically. And what did he teach? He began to teach the soul of Judaism that is so vital to really be a passionate human being. The truth is that Arizal, if you look in the context of history, who lived in the 15th century, so smack between the 12th and the 17th, began to teach these teachings, but they were very esoteric and most people could not relate to it, except his own students. But he did say, Mitzvah legali zeis hachachma. The time has come to reveal this wisdom. So here's a story that captures this in the most powerful way. There was a big debate. Are we all right? There was I'll start with, I don't like the sacrilegious parallel, but in your honor back there, I'm going to say it, okay? In the 60s, there was a debate between Aldous Huxley and Timothy Leary. These are two gedolim in the world of LSD. Two big leaders. And they were both experimenting. Leary was a professor of psychiatrist actually in Harvard, until he was kicked out because of his experimentations. And Aldous Huxley was this thinker. And LSD came on the scene, and for them was expanded consciousness, and so on. Now, don't take this as an endorsement. This is just observation here. And the debate went like this. Leary felt that everybody on Earth, everybody in the United States should be given LSD, and the world will become a world of peace because everyone will have this expanded, maybe you should come and check this expanded state of consciousness. Some even had a conspiracy to pump it into the water mains of Washington, D.C. and Moscow. So the leaders should... And Aldous Huxley was an elitist and said, this is not for everybody. This is not to be abused. This is just for those that have earned the right, people who are evolved, enlightened. Are we all right?
Okay.
Why am I mentioning this? I mentioned it almost in a humorous way, but lahavdil alef havdalas, for those that need that distinction. You have these two opinions also in the Jewish world. You may know about the Kabbalah, and you hear people say, the Kabbalah is only for the mature, only when you turn 40, only for people who have already studied the rest of the Torah, because you don't begin eating dessert before you finish the so-called the meat and potatoes. Okay, that's one argument. And yet you see how it's become more and more known, and it's spread, especially as I mentioned, the world of Chassidim. And we know there was a debate between what they call the Chassidim and the Misnagdim. Misnagdim were those that opposed the spreading of these teachings. They saw it as heretical or whatever it may be. Now, what's the essence of this debate? I'm not talking now the petty or the partisan personalization of individuals who have their own issues. I'm talking philosophical. What was the philosophical debate going on by people who are of quality? It was similar to this discussion, that you cannot go and just take the so-called the secrets of Torah, the esoteric mysteries of the mystical teachings, and just open it up for everybody. People won't appreciate it. It's too subtle, it's too refined, and it requires a heightened state of being, an evolved state before you study it. And this is true. You look in the Talmud, it says that ein dorshin ma'aseh merkava ela b'yachid, which means you should not study the story of the chariot, which is the cheskel, the visions of the prophets, the mystical visions, only alone, only privately with one person. It shouldn't be a public thing, because it's about quality control, and it will be abused or misunderstood or not appreciated. Especially when you get into the esoteric, where you need to really have a lot of ability to abstract. Because when you read Kabbalah, there's a lot of allusion to sexual stuff. There's a lot of allusion to material that if you don't have a refined state of abstraction, you can, what they call megashim it too much. You turn it into something too, hedonistic. And you see that. You may have heard of Jacob Frank, and of course Shabtai Tzvi. These are all part of this period of time, by the way. Shabtai Tzvi was right at that period, almost close to the Takvatat, that period, right afterwards. Who actually was a reason, because the Jews had fallen, such their morale was so low due to all that, so they were very susceptible to a guy's coming Messiah. Like to them, this time has come after all this suffering, perfect time. The Shiach comes right after the darkness. And then there was Jacob Frank. Now we all know the end of Shabtai Tzvi's story. He converted to Islam when he was threatened, and he became a complete apostate, etc. Jacob Frank was even worse. He had studied a little, dabbled in Kabbalah, and turned it into his own orgy, basically, literally. Because he took the literal interpretations of Kabbalah and said, you want to reach the highest levels of unions, yichudim, it has to be through illicit relationships. Initially, that's what he preached. Obviously, it was very appealing to certain groups, because you can do anything you like. There's no discipline. So you can imagine what kind of backlash that created among the more faithful, and they were terrified. So when they saw the Baal Shem Tov come around, oh no, who knows what he's going to do? Very suspicious. I remember then also it wasn't easy to check up on someone. It wasn't like today, you just travel, just hang around with a guy, check his email history, his Facebook, and see if he has any skeletons in his closet. This was like, it was a lot of hearsay. One person distorted a rumor. They say, Baal Shem Tov is doing miracles, etc. So there's a lot of distrust. And even legitimate. So not all of this agreement was based on hate or just sinas chinam, baseless hatred. It was built on you could say legitimate concerns and fears of what was just seen. Especially when you start using Kabbalah. Because then you're starting getting into the area of the soul, and it's esoteric. They're far easier to be a con artist and a Kabbalist than a con artist and a Baal Nigla, because in halacha, what are you conning already? There's either you know the law or you don't know the law. In the Kabbalah, you could say, I could see your previous lives. I need another $1,000. The meter is running. because then I'll tell you about more previous lives. I'll just give you an example of how it can be manipulated. And someone who's vulnerable or is impressionable, very easy. I'll read your palm, I'll read your face, I'll sell you this, I'll sell you that. It's very easy to become, because it lends itself, because you're dealing with a world that is very invisible. You can't prove anything. Go disprove. I told you that your previous life you were a parakeet. How are you going to disprove that? This is the reason the argument was against a type of widespread of these teachings. And during the time of the students of the Baal Shem Tov, a story that happened with the Alter Rebbe, the Baal Tanya. The Baal Tanya began to explain these teachings in a way that started reaching larger numbers, called Chabad, intellectually and rationally explaining esoteric ideas. And his own colleagues, some of them, found that to be problematic, because that was literally feeding into the masses. You're giving them now information, teaching them this. That was a problem. And there were debates whether this was acceptable. As a matter of fact, some Chassidim, when they heard the Baal Tanya start teaching Chassidic thought in rational terms, began to cry, because they felt it soon will be abused by people who don't appreciate it. So you imagine, just to give you an example, imagine you are in a small select group club. The secrets, the deepest secrets of music, that's passed on carefully from teacher to student for thousands of years. And suddenly someone starts teaching it in a way everybody can get it. And we're not talking about trying to control it for commercial reasons or protect intellectual property, but you start seeing people not appreciating it and losing its so-called quality. It's very disturbing. That was the reason of the opposition to spreading of Kabbalistic teachings. But when the Arizal said, Mitzvah legal zeh chachma, this time has come to reveal it, he was an authority. He had the right to say that. That was a change. And it began to be taught. By the time it came around to the Baal Shem Tov, as I mentioned, who was born, as I said, right that same century of Chaf Sivan in the 17th century, it began to proliferate it even further. And as the classic letter that he wrote to his brother-in-law, the Baal Shem Tov, that he heard from the Messiah, Mashiach, when will you come? He said, when your well springs will spread outward. Outward. So for many, even Kabbalists, even legitimate thinkers, that was a problem. Who says that's appropriate? As I said, we had seen in history witnesses, Jacob Frank, Shabtai Tzvi, others who distorted, abused, and ultimately desecrated Kabbalah and Torah and so on. The Torah says, the Talmud says, when you study Torah properly, it's Sam Chaim. It's like medicine. If you study it improperly, it's Sam Mavis. It's like poison. So you can take the same Torah with all its perfect beauty and use it the wrong way, and it can become a poison. And the Baal Tanya struggled with this question, which is why in Chabad Chassidim lore it says that the day of Yutas Kislev, the 19th of Kislev, was a big day when he was liberated from prison, because it wasn't just seen that he was informed upon, but it was like a Gzeira L'mayla Kitrug, so to speak, a challenge in heaven as a time has come for you to teach this Torah. So you always think about it. People ask me the question. I always to wonder, hey, God Almighty, something people do all kinds of who knows what. Here a man is spreading Torah. Why would there be a crime? You could say a crime. Someone's doing something, a real crime. We have real crimes. We have murder. We have inappropriate behavior all the time. Spreading Torah, since when is that like a problem? But it's a problem because if it's not taught to the right people and it's going to be abused, it can be a challenge. And there's a long story about it, but at the end of the day, he came out of prison, was seen as a vindication that the time had come to spread it further. So there's a story, I think it was Pinchas Koretz, I'm not sure who it was, but the Baal Tanya was standing with him, and he was one of those that was questioning whether the time has come to really explain these ideas. And his argument, as I said, was that it would be abused. What happened? Luck would have it, or the Hashem had it this way. This was divine providence. As they're standing there, they see a Bletl Chassidus, a page from one of the Chassidic discourses, fell on the floor. So this, I think it was Pinchas Koretz, says to the Baal Tanya, you see, it was clear. You see, it's becoming cheap. It's losing the value. Imagine, why is a Torah scroll, for example, in an ark, and we see the whole fanfare to take a Torah scroll out of the ark? We say special prayers, Vahi ben Seir Aaron. We stand there, because it's a precious thing. You don't want a Torah scroll being cheapened. Precious things are kept covered, holy of holies. And here, he saw this page on the floor, meaning it's not being appreciated. People take for granted if you don't preserve the integrity. And that's when the Baal Tanya shared with him an unbelievable example. You may have heard it, but if you think about it, it's a tremendous example. First of all, leadership, of love, and above all, of when the time comes when you have to sometimes take risks. He gave him the example of a ben chayla, of a sick child. Became so ill, all the doctors gave up hope on him. And he was the child of the great king of a kingdom. And all the doctors had said he will die. He was in a coma. Nothing worked. One doctor, they would look for doctors all over the world. The king had all the wealth in the world, so he looked for every medical expert. They found one doctor, some alternative doctor, who came and said the following. The king has, of course, precious jewels that are the collected rare jewels, but the most rarest of all is which one? The most precious stone in his crown. The king's crown. It's a symbol of his leadership, a symbol of his sovereignty. He says that stone comes from a very rare quarry somewhere, and it has, if you crush it, it produces a powder that you don't find anywhere on earth. If you mix that powder with some liquid, and we can get a little of it, a drop in between the clenched teeth of the sick child, it may help him. It may revive him. So the Baal Tanya said, so what did the king do? This would be the precious stone. You can't return it. Once you crush it, it's crushed. You can't turn powder back into it. And it's not even sure. Maybe one drop, and the rest of it will just spill away between clenched teeth of a comatose child. The king, without hesitation, said, obviously, what do I need this crown? And what do I need this whole palace and my whole kingship if I don't have my child? And they crushed it. That was his example. He said, when the Jewish people were healthy, the world was a healthy place, you may not have to go dig that deep. But when there's a situation where you see someone is sick or ill, and his soul is at stake, then yes, it's true. Much of the stuff, much of the crown, the jewel, will be wasted, may be wasted, spilled out. But one drop saves his life, it's worth it. This was his example, why we have to dig deeper when times are darker. So at the same time, even though we speak about Yeridas Haderis, which means that there's a certain devolution, a certain descent in generations. Times of Moses we consider to be a very enlightened, Dardea, enlightened age. And in our times we consider to be simpler souls. But there's a depth and a renaissance of Jewish life that didn't exist ever, not even the time of the temple. First of all, the sheer volume, and even the depth of Torah. So maybe not everybody appreciates it. And the teachings of the deepest secrets of Chem de Gnuza. The same argument the angels made. What did the angels say when Moses went up on Sinai? Exactly the same thing. This is your most precious treasure. What are you giving it to Yelid Isha, to this man of flesh and blood, Moses? And what does God say? You, Moses, answer them. Moses is terrified of answering because they have a good point. So what does Moses do? He holds on to God's throne. And he says, let's open the Torah. What does it say? I am your God that took you out of Egypt. Were you ever in Egypt? He told the angels. I am the God. Honor your parents. Do you have parents? Don't steal. Do you have a temptation to steal? Where is this great gift given? Not to angels in heaven who can sing God's praise, to a lowly world of inferior human beings who will definitely abuse the Torah. We see it all the time. The Ramban, Nachmanides, has to make a whole statement, Teshim Tiyu, be sanctified, because there's a novel, Breshus HaTorah. This is the Middle Ages, let alone today. Someone who's despicable and uses Torah for his own selfish purposes. That's addressed as well. You don't need the headlines of today to know that. Why? Because that's where the most precious jewel comes. When did the greatest jewels of Judaism revealed? After Chaf Sivan. So yes, it's a dark day that reminds us of massacres, but it also set in motion an antidote. Magdim refu lamaka. The antidote precedes the cure precedes the illness. Teachings that can help a generation like ours. Because we live in a world today where 95% of the Jewish people are assimilated. 50-60% into marriage. I mean, that's unprecedented. 500 years ago, it didn't exist. That's why they may not have needed such a precious stone in a revealed way. Few people, the carriers of the carriers of the torch, so to speak, the carriers of the flame, knew the inner teachings. Today, and I can testify to this, because the work I do, I grew up in a traditional home in the so-called inner sanctum of Jewish world. But I deal today mostly with secular people. There's no way to reach them without the spirituality of Torah. Because they don't know what Shabbos is. You can't just say, hey, you grew up with it, it comes to you mechanically by rote. The Talmud says, the guy came into a synagogue and he heard Modim, Talmud Yerushalmi, Menafshe Korach. Automatically he leaned down. Now Modim, when you say it here in the prayer, you're supposed to lean down and say it. You bow your head. So everybody interprets this as like a positive. He's so trained that he doesn't have to think. The truth is, if you really read it, it's a negative. It's so mechanical he doesn't think. It's completely cultural. It has nothing to do with Avodas Hashem. It's mechanical Judaism. So yes, habit has its power, but it also has its downside. It loses vitality. It doesn't have passion. And it can become something that's completely robotic. So it may work for some people, but for anyone that has a little life and starts looking, is this guy just another cultural puppet, or is this person have any independent thinking? Is they doing it with a passion? So once upon a time, 500 years ago, this was not a question, because Jews lived, whether they liked it or not, in an insulated world, and even if they wanted to assimilate, they couldn't assimilate. Nobody wanted them. You couldn't join the universities. You could not go you couldn't join the trades. Jews were actually prohibited from doing most of the trades. That's why finance was born. Modern finance was a bunch of resourceful Jews who figured out how to create a business out of money, because it was not a trade that was off limits. The Rothschilds and so on. Which led to the conspiracies of Jews owning all the banks, etc. So you couldn't assimilate if you wanted. So on one hand, yes, it was a very pure, you could say unassimilated world for Jews. But it was also, you can say, they had no choice. What would happen if they had a choice? Look what happened. When the walls of the ghettos came down, assimilation began, and today you have, as I said, 60% intermarriage. Same Jews, they have the same parents. Every frum Jew today has the same grandparents. They all came from the same world. That is why there's no choice. That without the soul of Judaism today, I don't know how it's possible to reach, especially the cream of the crop, intelligent and creative. You have to reach people who are robotic by nature anyway, conformists. So okay, you conform to this, you conform to that. But to reach people who are thinkers, who are readers, who are skeptics by nature, and who never grew up in a home, who don't even know what Shabbos is, what are you going to grab them? They have no nostalgia even to hold on to. So yes, maybe some people will say, it's interesting, intriguing that Jews once kept Shabbat. Maybe I'll try it. But when you bring the spirituality of it, what is Shabbat? What does it really mean? Why do we keep Shabbos? The fact is, most frum Jews keep Shabbos because they were born with it. And many will even admit off the record that if I wasn't, I don't know if I'd keep it. I don't want to go into that Lashon Hara right now. But it's cultural. You keep it because you grew up with it, not because you made some big philosophical choice and you really looked at all the options and I decided Shabbos is the best thing for me. When a person who never kept Shabbos because they didn't know about it and they embrace it, you tell me why? Because they discovered a true, real experience that they didn't experience elsewhere. Why else? They don't have the culture. And this came as a result of darkness. Here's how you see how light comes out of darkness. So when were the deepest secrets of Judaism taught? Of mysticism? When the darkest times, because that's when you need it. And a second reason given for it is because it's also as like an Erev Shabbos, Tayamer Chaim Zachu, an appetizer for the future utopian world of the Messiah. A world where spirituality will dominate. So how's the best way to prepare for that? Is where spirituality arises. So the Zohar says the following, that the year Tafresh, it's a prophecy in the Zohar written 2,000 years ago, that in the year Tafresh, which would be the equivalent of 1840. 1840 is the 19th century, right? Right after the 17th, 18th century. There'd be a revolution. The Zohar is on the Pasha Noach. It talks about Beshit. The Torah says about that in the 600th year. So the Zohar says that's referring to the 6th millennium. In the Tafresh, in the 6th millennium, in the year 5600, 5600, there will be an explosion. That's what the Zohar says. And there'll be an outpouring of the well springs, both from wisdom above and wisdom below. Those are the Zohar's words. And the commentaries explain wisdom above is the esoteric, Kabbalistic teachings, and the wisdom below is a revolution in science. And this is, by the way, across the board. Both Chassidim and non-Chassidim embrace this. The Vilna Gaon, who was by no means he was the head of the non-Chassidim, even though they call him a Chassid, all cite the Zohar, and they explain 1840 is what? Is essentially the date that the Industrial Revolution is identified. 1840 is the height of the Industrial Revolution. And people wonder till today, how is it possible? Innovation comes cumulatively. Let's say over a period of 1,000 years, every 100 years there'll be a new innovation, every 50 years. But in the period from 1840 till 1920, there was more explosion of more innovations than the previous 2,000 years. No one really understands why and how. It should have been staged every, steam engine in the 17th century, electricity in the 18th century. Here it all came together. And the 20th and 21st century is just accelerated. From the Zohar's answer is very clear. There comes a point in history where there's an explosion, an eruption. All this was a direct outgrowth of the darkness where things hit rock bottom in the middle dark ages. Similar to what I said before, that freedom and democracy began, when after the Black Plague, because the workforce became so low, they suddenly were empowered. So Chav Sivan, this 20th of Sivan, which, as I said, is the day that is honored, some actually fast, due to the massacres in 12th and 17th centuries, was also the beginning of a dawn that changed the world, the Jewish world and the entire world. Just for the record, the birth of the Reform Jewish movement was also in that century. Mendelssohn lived at the time of the Baal Shem Tov. It's not an accident. Because as I said, Magdim Refuah L'Maka, that the illness, the cure precedes the illness. To reintroduce any human being today, whether a person born into a religious environment or one not, the only way to ignite passion is you have to touch the soul. If your soul is not touched, there's no way ritual can create passion. The soul is touched, then there's passion. Now, at the same time, Judaism isn't just about passion. It's about a fusion of soul and body, passion that's grounded in action. And that's where this day, that's why I was fascinated by this concept. Because when you look back, you just see it as another stage in history. But if you know the story of Purim, people are not aware that the Megillah did not happen over a month or two. It's 9 years. From the time where the Megillah begins, that Achashverosh came to power over 127 countries, until the end of the story is 7 to 9 years. And if you lived at the time, you'd think nothing's happening. Or definitely kinds of random activities. Here, Achashverosh becomes king. He happens to throw a party. He happens to get upset at his wife. He happens to kill her. He happens to start looking for another wife. It happens to be Esther among all of them. And then Mordechai happens to overhear a conspiracy. And then the king happens to have insomnia one night. Who doesn't have insomnia once in a while? So if you were there and you read, let's say, the New York Times of the times of in Persia, okay, so one event has nothing to do with the next. And then suddenly it all converges. You connect the dots, you look from a bird's eye view, and you see a pattern. All history is that way. Kierkegaard said, you cannot understand your life, we can only understand our life backwards, but we have to live our life frontwards. And when you look back, You see a whole bunch of series of coordinates while you were here, there, and you see patterns. Doesn't always emerge, it sometimes takes a lifetime. But in Jewish history, you see it absolutely. No one could understand certain events throughout history, but you look forward and you say, hey, it all adds up. When the Jews were in the throes of Egypt, you'd think, what is this? What is this for? And suddenly you see a nation is born out of this. And they're standing at Sinai. And now they're 3,300 years later, and we're telling the story. It all leads to places. Everything is a journey. Like, a guy told a child that lost his parent at a young age. So they're standing out in the field, and he's trying to console them. And he saw an apple had fallen off the tree. The apple was already half deteriorated. I don't know if you've ever seen how apple gets absorbed back in the ground. It's quite fascinating. It's like literally, it's like being swallowed up into the ground when it's still half like decomposing. You can see the apple is turning into something else. So he tells he looks at this and he tells the child, remember, everything is a journey from one place to another. Everything is on its way to another place. It's not necessarily take away the pain of death, but it's a way of understanding life in a far more complicated way than we'll ever know. It's a journey. Everything's a journey. The Rebbe Rashab once told to someone, he was in Austria, was the first Ferris wheel, was I think built in 1890 something. It was a famous Ferris wheel in Vienna. And when pictures of it came, or they traveled there, so the Rebbe Rashab once told a guy who fell on bad luck in Parnassa and his business, he said to him, you see the Ferris wheel? What's the lesson of Ferris wheel? That life is a galgal acheze. Life is a turning wheel. One day you're on top, the next day you're on the bottom. So when you're on top, remember the wheel keeps turning. And when you're on the bottom, remember the wheel keeps turning. That's the secret how the Jews always knew. They always knew they're on a journey. Because from the beginning of our history, journey is embedded in our genes. Everyone is journeying. Adam and Eve are journeying out of the Garden of Eden. Noah is on a journey on the water. Abraham, Lech Lecha Ma'artzecha journey. Yitzchak's on a journey. Yaakov's on a journey. Always journey. Everyone. Yosef Hurad Mitzrayim a journey. The Jewish people in Egypt. Then they're out of the Egypt, and they finally are going to the Promised Land. No, another journey. 40 years, 42 trips. And you think the whole Torah, most of the Torah is a journey. I mentioned it a number of times. Chumash Bereshis covers the period from Adam till the end of the tribes. The first 2.5 chapters of Exodus, Shmos, is the exile in Egypt. And the rest of the entire Torah, from the middle of Beshalach, middle of Boy, the middle of Boy through Maseh and through Dvarim, is 40 years. A journey. Journey is embedded in us, because life is a journey. It's not static. It's only human beings, especially in the modern age, that created the concept of a couch potato. Someone says, what are you doing? Nothing. And they're like proud. They want an award that I did nothing today. It's an achievement. The guy was sitting on a park bench ankle and he's all depressed. And his friend comes and says, why are you so sad? Why are you so depressed? He says, my wife is angry at me. He says, so what's the chiddush? What's nothing new about that? She's always angry. He says, no, today was really bad. What happened? In the morning she asked me, what am I going to do today? So I told her nothing. So she said to me, you told me that yesterday. And I told her I wasn't finished. He wasn't finished doing nothing. So there's a thing called doing nothing. Couch potato. Nothing in life, not one thing in life is static. It's only we have tried to create this type of slow down and just stop. Look in life. Animal kingdom, the plant kingdom. Everything is in motion. And we love the word mobility. But we also have tried to create a concept that, I just sit around watching television. The television is in motion. Barely. And I'm watching it. So you live vicariously through other people's movements. You're watching other people. I started writing a poem once. I watch people. You can go on and on. It would be a very long poem. No new stanzas, just the same line. So, my friends, what the story is this, that everything is a journey. And a day like today, when you remember in history what happened, that's sad, but it also was part of a kernel, a seed that was planted. The difficulties that our grandparents went through is in order for us to have what we have today. Now the challenge today is, unfortunately, the greatest disease of all. Not the French and not the Germans, not in the 12th century, not in the 17th century, could do what freedom does. And that is the death of the soul, complacency, apathy. You know, the guy that asked his friend, what's worse, apathy or ignorance? And he says, I don't know and I don't care. You know, apathy. The kiss of death. In Yiddish, it's a word, Gleichgültigkeit. You know this word? It's a good word. Apathy, indifference. And what it comes, it's a direct byproduct of comfort. So the blessing can be the biggest curse. So by no means do we pray for returning back the clock to a time of oppression and suffering. Obviously not. Today we need to declare war with the same passion that we fought the wars our parents fought back then against real enemies out there, against the enemy of complacency. Passion is our savior. You're not passionate about good things, rest assured you're going to become passionate about bad things. No way, because a human being by nature needs excitement, needs adventure. Boy reik ein boy mayim. If the pit is empty, without water, rest assured, nechashim v'akravim yesh boi. All kinds of serpents and scorpions. That's how it is. Nature abhors a vacuum, right? So does the human spirit. Boredom. You're bored. Oh, that's a big problem. Now you think, what's the big thing? I'm bored, so what? It doesn't sound so dangerous. I once was speaking for a group of kids, late teens, 18, 19, who were in rehab. They were already rebounding from drug and alcohol problems. So they were, they had gone through tough times and they were serious at this point because they were like healing. One of them knew me, so he asked me to come, informal, called gathering, get together. And I asked them, I wanted to get to know them, so I asked them, what brought you? No human being on earth wants to be addicted to anything. It's just not the dignity of a human being. I should be dependent on something. No, who wants that? So how did you get trapped in that place where you suddenly your life got out of control? To the point some almost OD'd, other things. Things that go against human nature. Nobody wants to become out of control in that way. And their answers were interesting. One person said he was going through a very difficult time at home, ugly divorce, he was just looking for some escape. Another guy said bad friends. Another person said it was more recreational, and then you suddenly get trapped in it. Everyone had interesting, different life experiences. But I said, but that's all not the root. How? Because there are other people who've gone through bad divorces in their homes or other bad things, and they didn't. So what's the difference? So I submitted to them, I said, it all begins with boredom. When you're bored, you have nothing to do. So you sit around, okay, one day you can bored 2 days. You are now a breeding ground for every infection possible. Where do infections fester medically? Where there's a vacuum. Where there's no protection. And they're vulnerable. It doesn't begin with some monstrous bacteria. It begins with an area that doesn't have defense. Boredom, monotony is one of those areas. It's very innocuous, it's innocent, it seems, okay, big thing. Nothing excites you. I always talk to people, I say, does anything excite you? They usually don't want to tell me what it is because they're embarrassed, but that was my goal. I'm not curious to know voyeuristic to know exactly what excites them. I was looking for something, eliciting something positive, a recipe for every problem. If you're lucky, maybe not, but you need a lot of luck. Because that's your soul is desperate, you're thirsty, you're hungry. Imagine a thirsty person. How long can they go thirsty? They're going to have to drink something. It's going to be either a healthy drink or it's going to be poison. So these enemies inside of us are very, very innocent and very quiet. They're silent. Because they're not those that come and say, hey, I want to own your soul. I like that type of devil. Very quiet. It's like the negative. It's like the vacuum. So the lessons we learn from the story like in this today, Chof, is that the negative can propel you to the most positive. But you have to identify it and you have to find that passion. That negative of Chof Sivim back then evoked some of the deepest strengths in Jews and revealed from God Himself the highest powers of Torah that we have today. We may not be on a higher level than generations past, but the Torah that's revealed to us is far higher than they ever had because we have what they have and more. Because there's no question there's more Chidushei Torah since Mount Sinai. which is interesting. The reason could be, as I said, because we're in more darkness, need more light. Our challenge is to awaken that passionate battle, to find a vision for which we stand, a vision, a divine vision. And whether you grew up in it, your challenge is not to allow yourself to be trapped by mitzvahs anoshim milamod of mechanical Judaism. And if you're not born into it, it's an unbelievable tradition that we have, a heritage that is really the legacy that belongs to all of us. That can tremendously ignite your soul in discovering your calling. I was going to connect it to the chapter, but because time is, some of us have curfew in New York, right? So I'll just sum it up here. I want to again say the class is dedicated to our dear friend Mark Malinsky. Asya passed away yesterday. Baz Ben Sion, and Sarah. And may everybody have only good news to share. On a concluding note, we do not know the infinite powers of our soul. That's the bottom line. We know a little minuscule part, the tip of the iceberg. And it's critical for us to really find ourselves is to be around people that are soulful people. Because that helps, it's contagious. It rubs off. So I want to wish you all a blessing that you should all find such individuals in your life and have a very soulful week. Next week's class will not be live here because I'll be traveling to the West Coast. But I'll be recording a class that will be online. So you can watch it from the comforts of your living rooms, bubble baths, and other comfort zones. But rest assured, I'm not going to talk about comfort zones. So if you're lying in one of those environments, I'll try to, wake you up a little. They say, someone told me you make happy people miserable and miserable people happy. So I kind of compliment, I guess. So everyone, until next week, those of you that we're meeting for the first time, it's an honor to meet you. If you don't mind, leave me your email address so I can be in touch. And I send out a weekly email. And any other way that I or the Meaningful Life Center can help and assist in your journey, don't hesitate to call out to me. And it's always an honor to intersect with other souls' journeys. And again, everyone should have a very good week. Thank you very much.